Good morning. This is Marshall Davis. This episode is an interview that I did with Colin Chapman on his podcast called The Red Church Door. Colin is an Episcopal priest who is the rector of a church in southern New Hampshire. On his website, he says that his podcast is first and foremost an open invitation to partake in a journey of spiritual discovery. It is an exploration about how people understand, evolve, and deepen their relationship with God, how their stories relate to our own experiences, and how we can inform and nurture the spiritual growth of ourselves, our faith communities, and our society. He came across my Tao of Christ podcast while doing a Google search for Christianity and non-dualism. He emailed me and asked to interview me for his podcast. So here it is.
Marshall, this is exciting for me. Rarely on the Red Church Door podcast do I get to talk to someone else who has a podcast. And so I look forward to there's a little bit of kind of some insider conversation in this. So this is good to have you on. So thank you.
Yep.
And this is not a video podcast. So the folks at home don't get to see you on screen, unfortunately, but you are a retired United Methodist pastor.
American Baptist pastor.
So you're retired American Baptist, but you're involved in the United Methodist Church now.
Yes, I'm part of a United Methodist congregation, and most recently, I was a pastor of the Community Church of Sandwich, which is a duly aligned church with United Methodist and American Baptist.
I see.
And I was a pastor there for two different occasions, for a total of 18 years. So I was officially appointed as United Methodist pastor, local church pastor, even though I'm an American Baptist minister. My ordination's with the American Baptist.
I see. So that's good. Oh, regardless of denomination or religion, when one assumes a retired pastor, you can assume of a certain age, not necessarily someone who often has their own YouTube channel and podcast. So it's sacred for your technological as well as spiritual wisdom. I'm really excited to have you on the show. Before we get into a non-dual approach to Christianity, I am fascinated by, we've already kind of gone there just a touch, your journey. You attended a Southern Baptist seminary. You received your DMin from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Correct. In Louisville, Kentucky. Yep.
And now you host a podcast called The Tao of Christ. From my limited exposure to the Southern Baptists, I can't imagine there are many Southern Baptists who also dabble in the Tao of Christ. I want to talk about the kind of the meaty stuff too, but how is there like a short story? How did you get from there to here?
Well, Southern Baptists aren't always what they are today. And the seminary that I attended, Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, is not what it is today. Today, it's really a very conservative, Calvinistic, and you could even say fundamentalist institution, where back then, you could, and people did, call it a progressive seminary. Now, the word progressive and Southern Baptist do not go together anymore, but back at that time, back in the 70s when I was there, and I got my DMin in 1983, which is right at the time when the turmoil was going on in the Southern Baptist Convention, what progressives call the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And of course, the fundamentalists see it as a saving of the seminary, from liberalism. So when I was there, it was quite open to a lot of things. For example, Thomas Merton used to come over to a Southern Seminary because he was in Kentucky also at the Gethsemane Abbey. So he used to come over and used to speak at Southern Seminary at that, back before that. He died before I was there. But so that was the type of place it was. It was really a ecumenical, open type of place, and they had a department of world religions and missions that concentrated a lot on world religions. And I took took courses there. In fact, I took a graduate seminar in Islam back in the 70s when I was doing my MDiv there. So that was the type of place it was back then, which fit in with what my interests were even before I went to seminary, because I went to Denison University, got my BA in religion, and at that school, and they were very interested in different religions of the world, both in the religion department and the philosophy department. So I took a lot of courses there also when I was there. So it's not as strange as it might seem to you that I would be interested in this at that seminary.
You'll have to forgive my, I guess, both prejudice and, boy, apparently some ignorance, that to just assume, right, Southern Baptist Seminary means kind of what it means for me nowadays. So clearly very different then. So you were introduced to Eastern religions there in Kentucky at that time?
No,
Okay.
I was introduced to it really in college, undergraduate degree, because I was a religion major and I really was very interested in the world's religions. So that's where I really began to do some study of it, as well as the more mystical aspect of Christianity. In fact, I did when I was a junior, I did a independent research on Meister Eckhart, for example. So
Meister Eckhart came up in our last episode too, where I proclaimed that I do not have the reading comprehension level to consume Meister Eckhart on my own.
Well, most of Meister Eckhart's things are sermons, actually, rather than theological tomes. So they are accessible.
So there's an overlap kind of from square one for you with some of the early Christian mystics and what you're receiving, what you're picking up in college too.
Yeah.
Right.
And I took some philosophy courses. I became friends with a philosophy professor there who was very interested in Chinese philosophy and Chinese language. And he was the one that really introduced me to the Tao Te Ching. And in fact, he had a classical Chinese class, which I took, in which we were actually translating the early chapters of the Tao Te Ching as part of it. So he was the one that really first, showed me that there was this rich spiritual heritage in Chinese philosophy, especially in Taoism, that resonated with my own faith.
What were some of those strands that you picked up on kind of early on as you started making these connections?
Well, I guess I should say, at that time I was simply exploring. I wouldn't have called myself even a Christian at that point. I was just really interested in different spiritual aspects. I actually entered into college as a freshman as an atheist.
Did you grow up? Did you have any church
yes,
background growing
up? I grew up in the United Church of Christ.
Okay.
In Danvers, Mass. And but it was just kind of a traditional 1950s, cultural religion type of thing.
Sure,
I really wasn't interested in that greatly. I did go to a private boys' school for high school in New Hampshire, and that was connected to the United Methodist Church at the time, although it wasn't strongly connected. But they did have chapel services, and they had a couple of religion courses, and they were taught by a United Methodist minister, actually. And so he also kind of, in these early years, my teenage years, opened up the possibility that this was something going on here. Only two courses that we had to take. One was philosophy of religion, and one was ethics that I had to take as a sophomore and as a senior. But we got into a lot of conversations. In fact, every year they would have some Franciscan brothers come over from a Franciscan, community that would talk to the whole student body, and they would talk about their love for the monastic life and so forth. It was very interesting. I mean, you wouldn't see that at a public high school, so I was blessed.
So the interest in these pursuits took root very early on as you were a
Yes,
teenager. Wow.
right, right. I mean, but they were just kind of explorations, and like I said, when I entered into uh, college, I was really an atheist. I would have connected most to existentialism. In fact, I would call myself an existentialist for a long, long time. Uh,
Mhm.
Even though I was starting in seminary, I would talk about being a Christian existentialist.
Hmm.
So there was that aspect to it too.
So where did you mentioned you were an atheist going into college, and then in seminary you were a Christian existentialist. Where did
Right.
the Christ come in?
Um,
Funny, I thought this was going to be more of an Eastern conversation, but here I am now. I'm interested in your uh, more of the Christian part.
yeah. Um, I was on a spiritual journey of exploration, looking at all different religious traditions, but there was a uh, there was a lure to Christ, I guess, because of my Christian culture and background, and I also started dating a preacher's daughter. That made a difference.
Yep, that'll
She
do
was
it. Sure.
yes, and as a result of all of this, and I stepped back from college for a little bit, took some time off, and I was working in my family's uh, business, hardware business in Salem, Mass. And during that time, I started to attend a Baptist church there, and I got to know the pastor there. And it was really through his influence that I really made a Christian commitment. So you would say I really made an evangelical Christian commitment to Christ
Hmm.
at that time.
Yep.
And then I came back to school again. And I'm the type of person, if I'm going to do something, I go into it wholeheartedly and completely. So once I became a Christian, and I would have called it at that time born again Christian, I would have used that language. It's really more kind of like the Jesus movement type of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I said, well, if this is reality, this is truth, I'm going to go in completely. And so I thought I would go on to a graduate program somewhere. And I ended up going to the Southern Baptist Seminary basically because my girlfriend, who became my wife,
Hmm.
her father went to the seminary. He was an American Baptist pastor. That's the connection here. He was an American Baptist pastor, and he had gone to the seminary and he spoke very, very highly of it, and ended up that he had a lot of the same professors that I ended up having. They were young when he had them, and they were older when I had them, but they were very, very good,
Same
good
ones.
professors. But my plan was not to be a pastor. My plan was to get a degree and go on from there and
Hmm.
possibly teach or something. That was I was never going to be a pastor. But once I got into it, and then later on when I decided to take some after my MDiv, I decided to see what it was like to be a pastor full time. And I need to get some money too. I had 3 kids, and
That's a thing. Yep.
yes, right. And so I was a pastor out in Illinois, and I loved being a pastor. So I changed my plans. I had already been accepted into the PhD program, actually, at the seminary, but I switched that over to a doctor of ministry so I could continue being a pastor. So my life changed. I decided I was going to be a pastor for as long as long as God wanted me to be.
And when did Taoism kind of come up? There was some introduction to that in high school, and then some connections in seminary. But when did that start to take a deeper root in your own spiritual journey?
It really began in college,
Oh, in
undergraduate
college.
program, in that with the philosophy professor who was really interested in Chinese philosophy. Uh, when we had to translate portions of it and we talked about it in depth, and he lived it. He considered he was a Quaker, but he considered himself really to be a Taoist as well. And so, it's my conversations with him that really uh, that really gave me some roots in this Tao Te Ching, and it continued from then on.
So let's take a step backwards for a moment and assume most of our listeners maybe have heard of Taoism, maybe the Tao Te Ching. Can you give a kind of a real basic 101? What is Taoism?
Well, there's popular religion of Taoism, and then there's the Tao Te Ching, and the philosophy of Taoism. And when
Okay.
most people talk about Taoism, they think of the philosophical aspect of it as based on the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching was written by Lao Tzu in the 6th century. Normally, it's considered 6th century BC. We actually have ancient manuscripts from the 4th century BC, so we know it's very ancient. But most people think that he lived in the 6th century BC. He was simply a bureaucrat in the government at the time, and he wrote this poetic work of just short little chapters. I think there's 82, I forget right now how many chapters there are, but it's a short little book, and each one is probably just a page on a separate page, so it's not very long.
Mm-hmm.
It's not philosophical really in the way we think of philosophy, or theological. It simply points to this deep reality of existence of the universe, which he called the Tao, which means the way, which means the way of the universe. And it simply is the basic principle, you could say, or the basic moving force, or the spirit of the universe. It is not mythological at all. It's not theoretical. It's very practical. It's very much related to the natural world. Which fits right in with Chinese philosophy and art, which connects human beings to the natural world very much.
Mm-hmm. And help me make the connection. Where did you see the connective strands between
Okay.
Tao Te Ching and Christianity?
When the earliest translation of the New Testament into Chinese translated the opening verse of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Tao.
Okay.
The Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. And so that there's a connection right there. That God and Tao. God as far as the word. Christ as the word somehow is the same as what the Taoists are talking about with the Tao.
Was that an intentional use of the
I
word Tao,
don't know.
or
At one time, I could have told you who the translators were. There were two translators at the time, and they both came up with this together.
But
I think they probably knew enough about Chinese philosophy and Taoism in particular to know that this was an accurate translation of what the Apostle John, or the author of the Gospel of John, meant by logos, the word, and that really was similar to what the Greek philosophy, logos, the principle, the universe, and what the Taoists were talking about. So I think they were trying to make that philosophical connection and that spiritual religious connection. And so that brought Christianity of my childhood together with the Taoism that I was learning even at that point. And that was before I would have called myself a Christian, but I still had a Christian background. I had gone through confirmation and all that stuff, when I was 12, 13, whatever.
Yeah. We keep coming back to John. John has been for me in the last while. It kind of excites me in its approach to this mystic understanding of the divine. Came
Yes.
up last week in our conversations with Jonas, and here we are again at John's prelude.
I did a whole series of talks, and it which turned out into a book called the Gospel of Non-Duality, which I subtitled a spiritual interpretation of the Gospel of John.
Hmm.
I really think that this non-dual approach is at the heart of the Gospel of John
Here we
and
go.
Christianity.
I'm gonna pounce because we're using this word non-dual, a
Okay.
word that I've only I stumbled across accidentally, looking for something to explain what I've been picking up along the way, and this is how I found you. I was googling kind of non-dual Christian, and your YouTube channel came up. Um, what does that word mean?
It's uh, it's become common recently, uh, but in the past it would simply have been called oneness. I would think it's another word for oneness, but
Mm,
it's uh, it's called non-dual because it's not one in the sense of a simple one, not one that is half of two, but this is one that includes the two and the three and the four. So it's a whole.
yeah.
It's a whole one rather than a singular one. And it understands all of reality is basically one. And that one is God. And there is no other. There's only one God. And this God really is reality, and everything else, including what we Christians would call creation, has all come from this one. And that means in its essence, there still is that one, because it cannot exist apart from this one that is God. Um, Philosophically, sometimes it's connected to monism, but it's not really a philosophy. This is really an intuitive, you could possibly say experiential awareness of the oneness that is at the heart of reality and the heart of our lives.
Hmm. And that's that's been the best answer I've heard, read, been given so far. Um, because when I try to explain this, even to myself or to my wife, about this is the things I'm reading about, I find myself falling into the Western trap of defining it by what it is not, which I feel like defeats the purpose of the non-dual perspective. Right? As soon as I start going down the road of it's not, I'm creating uh, a duality. It's this or this, when it's bigger than that,
Yeah.
right?
Although, in a sense, non-duality is the via negativa.
Hmm.
It is, the only thing, you can say about God is what God is not. Anything you say about God positively is liable to become an idol.
Hmm.
So you can't really say anything about God. You can't think anything. Any ideas that we have about God are not really true.
Hmm.
And so God is only what God is not. I mean, the Buddhists talk about neti neti, not this, not that. That's what ultimate reality is. And that's what I say God is. God is not this and not that. God is something that includes this and that. And therefore, it is non-dual, is one.
And the core of the via negativa,
Via
the
negativa, yes.
via negativa is almost a celebration of not knowing,
Right. The
right?
cloud of unknowing, for example,
Hmm.
yes.
Hmm.
It's it it realizes that our human minds, and everybody knows this to a certain extent, everybody knows that anything we think about God is too small for God.
Hmm.
Everybody knows that God is bigger than than our thoughts. But this goes really beyond. It takes that to the nth degree, if you will. That this is reality is cannot be contained in any way by our language or by our thoughts that are behind our language or by our brains that produce our thoughts. This is this is beyond. But at the same time, we can be intuitively aware of this
Hmm.
as where all our thoughts and ideas and words come from. We know this. Everybody knows this, I think. They know this deep down behind who they think they are, their personality. Behind all of that is this this that cannot be named,
Yeah, yeah.
behind it all. And that's what non-dual is.
I think, and I don't mean to use this as this or you, the podcast, as my personal spiritual direction. I'm figuring all this out as I go along, but I think we're coming to how why this is so exciting for me at this point in my own Christian journey, religious journey. Out now, almost a decade out of seminary, not very long, but coming from an institution, particularly the one I went to, General Theological Seminary in New York, one of the oldest Episcopal seminaries, very much rooted in the Episcopal way. I was given the answers. It was 3 years
Right.
of here are your answers, and mostly the answers, the Book of Common Prayer. Uh, and then entering parish ministry, there was this sense of the answers was given do not align with the church that I've inherited. And my only response has been like, well, now I don't know. I don't have answers anymore. And I think what I find so liberating about this path is it's okay. I don't need to know. Not only do I not need to know, that's kind of the point. Because I
Right.
can't know.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what this is all about. There are no answers, basically. And anybody who says they have the answers are deluding themselves and others.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we get in trouble with mainstream Christianity that wants to have the answers. They want to have the creeds. They want to have the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or whatever other doctrinal statement you want to do. They want to say, this is true. This is about God. This is about Jesus. This is about whatever. Human beings. This is about the world. This is about salvation. These statements are all true. And but they aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
They're only true in a really relative sense in the way that the brain is trying to grasp at
Mm-hmm.
straws to somehow, connect to spiritual reality. But ultimately it can't. It's impossible to do that. But at the same time, deep down, there's something in us, which is our true nature, that is already connected to this deep reality and knows it. We know what is true, we just can't speak about it. And that's what the Tao Te Ching says, that those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. That, and we all know that. I mean, and you have just articulated that really, really well. That what the academic institutions teaches you might be, it's just scratching the surface. You know what I mean? It isn't true reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the brain trying to get a hold of it.
It felt like a framework of
Yes.
understanding something
Yeah.
that I
Right.
could not
Right. Right.
understand.
Right.
Um,
And
and
it's
that's
useful. It's useful to a certain extent, as
mhm.
long as you don't really think it is true.
Well, and I hesitate to reduce what the church has given me as a model, but what it feels like in the divine is something so incomprehensible. Uh, because the way I like to preach about it is that this is I am creation trying to understand the creator, and in the same way, a painting is trying to understand the artist. Right? I
Right.
can't. So I've been given models of understanding, and if in many ways the model of understanding, even the model of relating to the divine, speaking largely to the liturgical expression in the Episcopal Church, where there's a formality, a drama, a spectacle, which helps point my mind upwards towards the magnificent of the divine, the magnificence of the divine. But also, I think how you said it only scratches the surface of the God that we're worshiping, we're proclaiming on a Sunday.
And the I mean, what you're talking about is dualistic as far as how the creature can relate to or understand the creator. But non-duality says that there is, in essence, no difference between the creation and the creator.
Yeah,
Now that
yeah.
goes against a lot of Christian theology, that wants to draw this dualistic difference, the separation. And that's where the whole idea of trying to overcome the chasm between human beings and God,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole idea of having a mediator between God and human beings. But in essence, there is no chasm, there is no divide, there is no dualism, there is
Mm-hmm.
one,
Mm-hmm.
and that is what we call God. And Christ, I would see as the one who, to a certain level, connects us to this, even though we're already connected.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in a gosh, I'm a nerd, right? So in speaking computer terms, and kind of off the cuff, like so, Christ almost seems to become the programming language, the emulator for how we it would relate to the divine. We were given God in our form, so I know how I can relate to human beings, and so we were given a human, a fully God human, to for that relationship, to say like, okay, I get that, and then even in that incarnation, we're given, and this is where my own theology comes into it, um, the perfect example of what love looked like, a self-sacrificial, forgiving, graceful love.
Mhm.
Um, and it's and I say all this because I think in my exploration of the non-dual lens, I keep coming back to the role of Christ, because at the end of the day, I still need Christ, both
Yes.
spiritually, but also kind of like vocationally too. Like if I find, like if this is all for now, like I need to find a new, and I still do, but it needs. I keep coming back to why Christ matters in all of it, and for me, it's that avenue to understanding God.
My favorite verse, life verse, if you will, is the Apostle Paul saying, "It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me."
Wow.
You see,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
we cease to be, and we are one with Christ, and that is, and Christ Himself came that we might be one with the Father. That's what His high priestly prayer in John 17 was all about. Or maybe,
Mhm.
the oneness that He has with God, He wants us to have with Him and with God. See, that's why I think the Gospel of John is really, and Jesus' teaching, as at least as presented in the Gospel of John, really is non-dual.
Mhm.
He is constantly pointing us to our to union with God.
Right.
And Christ as a person, and even his death upon the cross, I think points us to that. His death upon the cross is really the extinction of him as an individual self, to be one with God, one with the Heavenly Father, and us be one with Him. It's anyway. So
No.
in spite of all this interest I have in connection I see with these other spiritual traditions, I call myself a Christian, and I believe I'm following in the teachings of Christ and following in the way of Christ, and not only in the Gospel of John, but right now I'm starting to do a little bit of more study in some episodes in the Sermon on the Mount. I just did one on
Mhm.
the Beatitudes, and I
Right.
think that
Yep.
Sermon on the Mount has a lot of that in it too.
That was your eightfold, your eight path.
Right, Fold Path of Jesus. Yes,
Right.
I was just working this morning. I was talking about the next couple of verses where he's talking about being us being salt and light, and there's a lot of connections there with other spiritual traditions.
So we need to wrap our time together, but this is a great place to kind of end. If our listeners have heard this conversation or are interested in kind of getting more, can you share some of the avenues where you create,
Right.
where we can find out more?
Yeah. Links to everything are at my blog site, which is marshalldavis.us
Mhm.
or pastordavis.com. But you can do a search for my name on Google, as you did,
Mhm.
and you'll come up with it. If you do a search for Christian non-duality, you'll come up with it. You can go to Amazon and do a search for my name or this, and you'll come up with it. So it's there. I think the
Yeah.
Tao of Christ.com is a link to actually the podcast site. And christiannonduality.net is a link to the YouTube channel. So I've got a lot of URLs, a lot of domain names.
And if you're interested in visiting any of URLs, you can find those in the show notes on your podcast app or right below this podcast if you're listening on our website, redchurchdoor.org. Marshall, I am so thankful for your time to be on the show. Also for fishing my spam out of your email many months ago when I reached out. Thank you for having this conversation with us.
It's been a joy. Thank you for inviting me to do this.